Thank you so much for joining our talk today with Mike Winkelmann, alias Beeple. And I think this is going to be a really exciting show for all the reasons that we just talked about. And I kind of rambled through, maybe showed my cards prematurely, but I didn't know that at the time. Um, as always, if you have any questions at the end of this conversation, we're going to be going through the Slack, I mean the chat, and trying to isolate some of the best questions that we can call on you to ask. So please put them in there. Um, and a special announcement as we are maturing this podcast and kind of growing the whole art world phenomenon, we have actually we have struck a partnership with our very first sponsor. So we're very happy to present today's live art world conversation with support from Digital Original. And if you don't know Digital Original already, they are a pioneering art tech software solution designed for galleries that enables them to create blockchain secured digital counterparts of physical artworks. So to find out more about Digital Original, please look at the top of the chat, which is now heavily populated. But if you scroll all the way to the top of the chat, you'll find a link to their website, which is actually totally fascinating. And it presents all kinds of philosophical kinds of knock-on effects. So that is a little rabbit hole to go down if you are so inclined. But now, on to the show. And thank you so much for coming on Art World, Mike.
Thank you so much for having me. I did not honestly realize this is going to be live, so I'm all super, super sorry that I was like late. I'm very, very sorry. I
Oh, no
totally.
worries. You know what? The thing is that my old lacrosse coach always said you got to kind of like keep your head on a swivel. And it's been actually fun, improvising over these past couple of minutes. So a little warm up. Anyway, let me just try that again so we get a clean recording. So thank you very much for coming on Art World, Mike.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me.
Okay, so I am so excited to talk to you right now because it just seems like you are the guy. You are the person to talk to. This has been a pretty discombobulating week with Trump and Elon Musk and Sam Altman and everybody else coming together in Washington to consecrate this new world order and somehow, all of a sudden build a Stargate, which I don't think I saw coming. But then I look at your work and think, okay, maybe I get what's going on here. Because I think that your art and your story more broadly seems to serve as a mirror for this contemporary moment. And I really want to unpack that with you. Um, and I think that maybe the best way to start is to actually revisit the thing that everybody knows about you, that famous moment that's almost like, the incident in the Zapruder film. That, and of course, this is your Christie's auction back in March 2021, where the NFT of your Any Everydays series sold for $69.3 million. And what I think is so interesting about that moment is that there's a sense sometime that it was almost like this random fluky occurrence, that it was this jackpot that you won as part of this like first overly enthusiastic like crypto boom, and that the work itself was so different from traditional art that it seemed kind of like a random lottery ticket. But looking back on it now, it seems that something else was going on. And can you talk a little bit about the story behind your everydays, and how you chose the kind of subject matter you depict in it, and how you grew your audience prior to becoming an NFT star?
Sure. Well, I appreciate the kind words there. And I think it does for the people who were not sort of familiar with my work prior to that sale. It does seem like, wait, who's this person? It came out of like nowhere. But I've been creating art and sort of like building an audience since 1999. And so, this is now over 25 years of kind of my artistic practice. And so, by the time that sale happened, I had already sort of amassed a couple million followers on social media and done collaborations with Louis Vuitton and done graphics for the Super Bowl and worked with, Sony and Apple and Meta and blah blah blah. And so uh, but I was doing all of this in a world that was very much adjacent to the um, traditional art world. So I can certainly see how it you could not have known about my work because the two worlds were just very, very separate. And I think to me, what I kind of recognized when I sort of learned about NFTs, which was only 4 months prior to that sale, was that this moment was a moment that had happened multiple times in art history where a medium was not considered part of the true sort of canon of art history. It was considered just something for craft. And that photographers were not really artists, and people who, made graffiti and stuff were not really artists, and people who made sort of vinyl collectibles were not really artists. And then suddenly they were, and maybe not suddenly, but they became part of the sort of like canon of kind of real art history or whatever. And so I kind of sensed that this moment had that potential, in that now there was a way to collect art in a manner that was natively digital and could prove scarcity, could prove provenance, and that there was a rapidly growing consensus around in terms of this is the way to collect art. And that once people were able to collect art in a way that they could all agree upon, that things could, that was the bridge that was kind of sort of like separating these two worlds.
Like the way you talk about the the format that's outside of the mainstream understanding of what art is, being that like kind of advanced, the tip of the spear for the evolution of art, I think is just so interesting and not always um, talked about enough that like people want to invest in art and they go to the younger galleries and they start to like try to buy up, stars who are rising. But maybe the savvier thing to do is go find the thing that's not art yet, but that eventually will become art. But what is so also interesting about your kind of incursion into this space, or potentially disruption of the space, is that not only the medium that you brought into it was new, but also the audience that you brought into it was new, and the tenor of the conversation that you brought into it was new. Because the memes that you kind of celebrate, satirize, and otherwise treat in your work are, they seem to be piped in from a different universe, from like the very careful, studied, even if it's outrageous kind of, like art modalities, there's still kind of very much within this ivory tower. But what you were bringing was something very much outside of the ivory tower. Can you talk about the audience that you were really, kind of building and resonating with and building a relationship with, and the modes that you were communicating with them through your work?
Yeah, I think that's exactly right, is that this brought a new audience of people who, many of which I don't think ever, just like for me, considered art collecting as like a thing that they would ever do. It's like that's like old people collecting old objects that don't really speak to me. And I think my work is very much of the sort of like internet. And I think now there's a new class of people who now see themselves as sort of like art
No,
collectors.
there's something near here called
Um,
Jeepusland National Parklet. That's our friend Geep.
Oh, Joyce, do you want to see if you can mute our audience member?
And so I think it really, sort of like opened the gates, because I was speaking about things that are in this sort of like of this new world, and sort of like concepts around sort of digital ownership, concepts around, decentralization, concepts around technology that really do speak to this new audience, and that, like you said, are not really themes that are being talked about in the sort of like traditional art world. And so I think you're going to see that sort of like continue. And I think I don't necessarily see it as being disruptive in a way. I see it really as kind of like being additive, and that it will continue to sort of like I see art as kind of this sort of like black hole that just sort of like continues to sort of like suck in more and more things as they kind of become considered part of the art world. And I think, to be honest, this was sort of inevitable in that digital art really, defines the entire kind of like visual language of almost everything we see. We're all looking at like a computer monitor right now, that the interface of it was designed by digital artists, and the movies, the video games, the TV shows, the web pages, the apps, the ads, all of these things that you see, those were not made by painters, those were not made by sculptors, they were made by digital artists. And so I think, this was obviously sort of in some ways a long time coming, but I just really see it as kind of like a natural growing of the art world, and something that almost, to me, is kind of like the graffiti sort of like movement being incorporated in art, in the sort of, 80s, 90s, whatever, in that I see what I do kind of being public art in a way, and that it's put out in the public. And I think when people think of public art, they usually think of, a bronze sculpture in a park or something like that. But in a way, this is really public art in that it's free to everybody to see on the internet through social media, and people can, immediately, without any sort of like gatekeeping, become part of this sort of like public dialogue around it. And so, yeah, I think it really did bring a new audience that, is going to continue to sort of like grow.
So I think it's kind of interesting to hold you in your mind at the same time as Banksy, where Banksy is using the actual, the urban street as his canvas, and you're using, social media as your canvas, and he's using graffiti as his, mode of communication, although it's really more like stencils. But you're using memes, which are kind of like the graffiti of the social media space. But at the same time, memes are totally serving a different role in our culture as well. And I remember listening to Elon Musk on the Lex Friedman podcast. If you want to listen to very long conversations with Elon Musk, that's a good place to go. And he was talking about how memes are his preferred mode of communication because they are incredibly nutritive in terms of information that is just packed into a really efficient, cheap, easy package that has zero barriers to entry, aside from maybe a little bit of familiarity with the you generally, very pop cultural phenomenon that's commented on. So can you talk a little bit about how memes interest you as a kind of like a communication format for your art, and how you approach them?
Yeah, I think memes, to me, which really have only become sort of like a theme of the everydays in the last maybe 2 years or so, I think are such an interesting topic that I think will have vast impacts on society outside of, sort of funny pictures on the internet. And I think that's what people think of in terms of memes now. But a meme really is an idea that is spreading sort of like virally through a group of people. And because we are so connected in this, sort of global network through the internet and through social media, finding ways to have your ideas spread quickly has a vast amount of power and impact. And I think that idea that unvetted, unchecked ideas can propagate quicker and quicker now. I mean, you just saw 3 days ago or 5 days ago or whatever, Trump launch his meme. And I thought what was interesting about it is he called it a meme. He didn't call it a cryptocurrency. I'm not sure there was even in the sort of like branding on it any mention of sort of like crypto. He called it the Trump meme. And um, you saw it quickly rise to a $70 billion valuation in literally like a day. And so the speed at which people are now able to sort of coalesce on an idea and translate that into action that affects the real world um, is just going to go quicker and quicker. And I think that is going to have just massive implications for society. And to me, I think, exploring that, through the artwork and sort of like talking about it, I think there's a lot to sort of unpack there.
Yeah, I mean, like I find it constructive to think about how, like, when Jeff Bezos wanted to, enter the kind of the public sphere as a media baron, he bought the most traditional newspaper he could possibly buy, the Washington Post. And Elon Musk instead bought this like churning cauldron of memes known as Twitter and now X. And you see like their respective the success rate of those investments is a little bit
100%.
diametric. I
Yeah,
mean,
yeah, and I think that will be looked back at as a very like he bought the 21st century newspaper. Like, you know what I mean? And he bought the media that is most sort of like relevant. And to be honest, I think a big piece of why he did that is he saw Trump got kicked off, and it's like, wait, if Trump could get kicked off, I could get kicked off. And the only way I can ensure I do not get kicked off is if I buy it.
so strange. I mean, like there's, in the great like Elon Musk kind of conspiracy world, the idea is that everything is Mars related, and that he bought Twitter to kind of like incubate some kind of social media form of governance for Martian colonies, and maybe that's what we're seeing playing out. But like to kind of bring it back into the art context, this is what I think is fascinating about these ideas of disruption. And you see, like in the broader culture, there's this idea that these cheaper, faster, more populist, more demagogic kinds of formats like Twitter and like memes are being very successful. And the art industry and the art establishment, not the auction houses, because auction houses are always trying to sell literally anything, but the art establishment in terms of museums and galleries to a certain extent are really kind of trying to hold the line. And as you were talking about this black hole of art swallowing everything, they're the ones who are trying to say, actually, we haven't swallowed that yet. We've swallowed those other things that used to not be art, but we haven't swallowed that thing yet. And can you talk a little bit about your experience, like, you know, after your Christie sale, how did you start? What was your experience encountering museums and galleries? Were they opening their doors to you? Were they kind of like keeping you at an arm's length? What was that like?
Yeah, I think it was something where I kind of, to be honest, got thrown into, a bunch of new worlds here pretty quickly. Because again, I was very new to crypto, so I was trying to like understand and navigate that world. And I was also very new to this sort of like traditional art world. Um, what I kind of very quickly saw though is that many of the people, and again, I was the guy who the day after this sale was saying, guys, this is a bubble. Like I very much understood that. And so in the crypto world, I encountered a bunch of people who suddenly were like, "Man, I love art. I care about art." Blah blah blah. And it's like, man, it seems like you just started caring about art like a couple minutes ago. And on the traditional side, I encountered a bunch of people who didn't were very kind of apprehensive, but I could tell that they cared deeply and had devoted their lives to art, much like I did. And so it was like, I do feel like I resonate with these people, a bit more. We have quite a lot of differences, but we're at least sort of like in the same dialogue in terms of just like really people who I feel like are going to give a shit about art 5 years from now. And not just see it as a vehicle for kind of like speculation. And so I sort of started being drawn into that world a bit more. And I would say it's something where, this is roughly 4 years out from the sort of like auction. I've seen a massive amount of sort of like interest, but I think it's still really, it's guarded a little bit. And I think, obviously seeing the kind of reputation that people have, or that the crypto space has, I can certainly understand that a bit, because there are a lot of pieces of it that are very scammy and speculative and criminal, to be honest. And so it really, I can certainly understand that. But I think it's one of these things where it's like, there's no kind of like going back. Like once it's in there, like there's no chance that people are going to wake up and be like, you know what? Actually, I don't even think photography is art. Like that's just not going to happen. So once you're part of the sort of like, once you're in forever, And so I think we're making inroads, and I think there's a lot of on my part, I think the time horizons have been challenging, in that I come from a world that moves very, very fast. And that's not the way that the sort of like galleries and sort of like museums work. But I do really think there is an appetite to sort of like understand this stuff and contextualize this stuff. And so I think it's just going to take a bit of time, but it's so hard for me to imagine. Like I literally just can't imagine 10 years from now that we're in a less digital place and that there's less convergence between these two worlds. I just don't see it, how that possibly could happen.
Like that separation of like NFTs and digital art, I think is critical and interesting. Because I think one of the things we learned from your sale and from that moment is that NFTs were both digital art, and they were obviously kind of like that format was invented by a digital artist, Kevin McCoy, but they were also simultaneously, in the same way that like a dollar bill is both an artwork and currency, they were also acting as these like derivative currency bets that people with a lot of crypto could use. And so that financialization thing led to this huge, speculative bubble. And now it seems that even with crypto winter and everything, that speculative bubble is no longer, it's not like it's gone away. It's just migrated to meme coins. It migrated to the thing that was disrupted in this Clayton Christensen format. That was like, it's just it's the cheaper, less thinky, more lizard brain, faster to market, version of an NFT where you don't need to think about art at all. So that kind of money seems to have migrated onto there. And you seem to have gone a little bit further into the digital side of things. Do you think that's fair to say?
Yeah, I mean, that's the thing. Again, I was making digital art, for many years before this. So this medium and sort of like NFTs, I personally see it as kind of one sort of like subset of digital art more broadly. And I think there's a lot of interesting things that can be done with NFTs as a medium in and of themselves, in terms of having different ways of looking at ownership, different ways of interacting with people through this sort of like medium. But again, I look at digital art as sort of, encompassing, video games potentially, and sort of like films, and kind of animations and immersive experiences, now kind of sort of like robotics and things like that, and AI, and many different things. And so I personally see it as just sort of like one aspect. In terms of the like the meme stuff, I think there was a huge subset, like you said, of people who were really only, to be quite honest, interested in NFTs from a speculative, this was the hot speculative crypto thing. And I very much sense that it's like, okay, these people are going to move on to the next thing. When the next shiny new crypto thing comes out, they will absolutely be done with this shit. And so the meme coins are a just by pure virtue of liquidity, they're a much better, vehicle for speculation. You can get in and get out in 2 seconds, anytime you want. You can buy $5 worth versus with NFTs, it's like, you have to buy, minimally so much, and then you have to find somebody who wants that exact NFT and blah, blah, blah. It's just not as good. And it's messier. In terms of the like, what is the value of it, And so I think the memes, obviously, a lot of attention and sort of like money has gone to that because it's, just a better vehicle for speculation. On the flip side of that, I really do think in some ways, like, I think it's very easy to dismiss it as not being art, but in a even more sort of like forward-looking manner, I think there is a way that you could look at meme coins and the performance around them as a sort of artistic practice, and the value of the meme coin is kind of derived from the sort of collective communal performance of the people who are participating in that, and how much attention that community can drive to what they're doing. Again, you could almost look at that as kind of like a sort of very performance art, through that lens. And in that way, I think I don't know. They feel like a bleeding edge art form in a way, almost, to me. And so, yeah, I think it kind of like remains to be seen where those coins sort of like lie on the, spectrum between pure commerce or pure speculative financial instruments, or kind of like art in a way.
I think like, the goatsy coin is maybe one of the more fascinating kind of philosophical, like artistic adjacent phenomena that I've heard of in a long time. And if anybody hasn't found out about this yet, you should listen to the Banksy, I'm sorry, the Bankless podcast episode about that. It's so weird. I mean, like an AI generated religion that has a meme coin attached to it, based on the most abhorrent kind of 90s internet meme. Um, which is like, I mean, I think that there's something that is so genius about that like the AI figured out exactly kind of what we've been talking about with memes and the way that they're impacting the political arena, is that, controversy is commercial. It's a commercial. And finding the most controversial thing that is the most kind of like based on this like this goatsy meme, it's irresistible to talk about, as you can see. I mean, I think you're onto something with meme coins being this bleeding edge. Uh, but to pivot a little bit back to museums, you now have your first ever museum show in the United States, a solo show uh, in Charleston at the Gibbs Museum of Art, and you also have a show at the Deji Art Museum in Nanjing that was curated by Hans-Georg Obrist, who was our season opener. How would you say you've evolved as an artist between Christie's sale and these museum shows? And how are you thinking about museums in the course of your, as how it fits into your practice?
Yeah, I think things have definitely shifted a sort of like massive amount. And to be honest, for the vast majority of my kind of, artistic career, physical objects were just no part of my thought process. Art was ideas that you put on the internet, and then you get ideas from other people who put art on the internet, and then you make more art and you put it on the internet, and that's it. And so sort of making physical works kind of sort of started out of the early conversations that I was having trying to explain NFTs to people. And then they were like, why would I pay money for a JPEG? And I was like, you know what? That's actually a pretty good question. Why don't I give you this physical thing to go along with it? And then you don't even need to worry about that question. We don't even need to sort of like talk about it. You're just buying this cool way of sort of like experiencing digital art, in your house. And then very quickly that kind of sort of shifted to these sort of bigger, kind of like sculptural structures that I started making. The first one kind of being Human One, and from then on, I really started thinking about how my art would be viewed in a public setting like a museum, which was just, again, no part of my sort of like thought process before. It was all just like, how is this going to look on Instagram, to be honest? Um, and so to me, it's really, exciting and fun and presents a lot of different new challenges and new opportunities for different types of interactions that I just didn't have before. And so I really do spend a large amount of my time now thinking about how this work will be experienced in a live setting. Also with the studio that I have here too, where we have a bunch of sort of like live events. Um, I also am thinking about how are people going to perceive this stuff in a group setting when there's sort of a bunch of people standing around looking at it. So yeah, I think um yeah, it's really just opened a whole new sort of like world of possibilities. And I think it's really something you're going to see continue in the future. This sort of blending of the lines between digital and physical. And I really think when I picture a museum, 30, 50 years from now or something, I just see a lot of it, to be honest, being more about interactive, quasi-physical, quasi-digital art that just feels very dynamic to me. Um, yeah.
So I had the good fortune of seeing one of like the tabletop versions of your new revolving sculptures
Mm.
at Pablo Rodriguez Frail's house in Miami during Art Basel, and it is beautiful. It is
Oh,
just
thank you.
a really mesmerizing, like clearly beamed in from the future, but beautiful object. Um, and in your museum shows now, you have these larger versions of them, where I think the most complicated one might be the Tree of Knowledge. That is it has this tree that is this like old growth, gigantic tree that has there are these two knobs on the outside of it. One of them allows you to amplify the signal. And if I'm explaining this correctly, I think that when you amplify the signal, more of the nature of the tree kind of is expressed. It's more of this naturalistic scene. But then there's another knob where you can turn up the noise, and the noise allows you to pipe in this live feed of current events and news piped in from the internet that gets algorithmically generated in terms of the way it's expressed in the tree. And so you can make the tree like an insane kind of almost like overloaded dystopian apocalyptic kind of thing, or you can make it something that's really calm. And then there's this other button on there where it says choose violence, and you're able to press that, uh, and then it burns down the tree, and then the tree reconstitutes itself. But you could do it only 660 times before the tree is no longer is just kind of like a burnt husk. And I love the way you're talking about the interactivity of the museum of 30 to 40 years from now, because when I think about this, it's almost as if it's a very high concept arcade game that has three buttons that you can kind of play with. And can you talk a little bit about the way that you're seeing interactivity uh, express itself through art, your art, and maybe potential future permutations of art. And why is that important? Why can't you just go to a museum and look at this thing on the wall?
Yeah, I think to me, I think there will be a sort of like big shift in digital art to be more interactive, because I think that is an aspect of that medium that is just, to be honest, not really possible in other sort of like mediums. A painting is a painting, and the idea that the artist would come and 3 years from now come into your house and change more of it is just like, what are you talking about? The painting is a statement frozen in time, versus I think digital art has the ability through interactivity to be and through just being dynamic, an ongoing conversation that sort of like continues to evolve. And so I think in a world where we're so media saturated and sort of like hyper saturated, the idea that these things would be interactive would be not interactive will seem almost like cave paintings to people like my kids who grew up on iPads and everything is interactive, and okay, I'm doing this and I have a million choices and whatnot. And so I think there's just so many different types of ideas with interaction, and absolute infinite amount of sort of like ways to have very meaningful interactions with art, that give each person, because art is obviously very personal. When you walk up to a sort of like painting, you have a different interaction with it than I do, because we have different, we're different people. And so I think having that be a bit more immediate and a bit more visceral in terms of the interaction that you have with a piece of art, I just think there's so much to explore there that I am, really excited about. And I just think you will see more and more of with digital art in the future.
Okay, I'm gonna throw a this is I think a really hard question.
Okay.
So so when I go to a museum like MoMA and you see something like Starry Night, which is the great most famous artwork that we have in New York City, um, you see all these people gathered around it, and none of them are having a good experience with that painting. Maybe they see a corner of it, maybe they stand in front of it for a second, but there's just too much commotion in front of Starry Night for anybody to really have an authentic experience with it. You're basically getting like a mental snapshot or like some fractional kind of whiff of art history with this original object. And I think of this as like the Starry Night problem, because you want to drive people into museums to have this like socially entangled art experience, but at the same time, in-person experiences are not that efficient because you just can't, you know, you can't serve that many people at the same time with a artwork. So when you're talking about something like an interactive artwork like this Tree of Knowledge, how do you solve this Starry Night problem with something like that if it's an in-person experience?
Um, that's a good question. I don't know. I don't think the Starry Night problem to me is necessarily. I I understand what you're saying about it, a problem, because you're sort of, you can't have one-on-one time with it and sort of like sit there and kind of like take it in, and in what you see as a more ideal setting to take in the sort of like work. Um, to me, I think, because I went to see it not that long ago, maybe a year or two ago. And yeah, it's just like a bunch of people standing around, like a huge crowd of people, and everybody's trying to take a picture of it and blah blah blah. But to me, that's almost like, um, I don't know. Like that is what the artwork is now.
Huh.
Like it is, I don't know that it's like necessarily like good or bad. Um, and so I don't know. I think digital art can sort of solve that, in that part of the reason that is like that is because the picture's not that big. You know what I mean? Like it's this big or whatever. And so yeah, if you have 40 people around it, it's not gonna be like that. Digital art can be very big. Again, looking at the MoMA with Rafiq's piece, you could have 100 people around it, and it's a very different sort of like experience because it was much, much bigger. And so I think really scale is a aspect of sort of like digital art that you can play with very immediately, because again, Rafiq's thing could have been shown on a 60-inch screen in the lobby. And I think it would have been like, oh, that's cool.
Huh.
But it wasn't. It was shown on a giant screen that it was like, huh, well, that's something I've not seen before. And so I think that was actually a really, really big piece of the like, what made that a huge kind of like moment and a huge success was literally just the scale of which you were seeing digital art, that makes it so different. Again, you look at like the sphere. Like the sphere, if the sphere was the size of like a planetarium, you'd be like, huh, cool. It's not though. It's fucking massive. And so I think that is an aspect that, and you look at immersive rooms, that I think can be very, very visceral, and where you can kind of have an experience like I think you're sort of we're hoping to have with sort of like Starry Night. And so I think that is one of the ways in which digital art really can sort of like solve that problem too.
Great answer. I mean, I think back, when you're talking about the line as being part of the experience, it's like the Marina Abramovich, the artist is present, the line was definitely a big part of that experience. So, and I can see what, Brian Zur, when he was on the show last year, he was talking about how digital art is so well positioned because for a fractional cost, you can scale it, and scale creates awe. And that's exactly that's what you were just talking about. So in this context, as like the black hole of art keeps on sucking in these like adjacent non-art things into its definition of art. Um, there seems to be a certain consensus that video games is next. Video games is like, the neighboring galaxy that's going to be sucked in to this black hole. How are you looking at video games from an artistic standpoint?
Yeah, I think to me, I really do think, video games, and I see that again as sort of like almost another sort of subset of kind of digital art. I see that really as being um, something that has, to me, all of the elements of any other piece of art. We just don't look at it through that kind of like lens yet. Um, and I think it has craft, it has, it plays with time, it obviously has tons of actual art in it. Um, but it's a world in which you are able to have a sort of singular experience that um can differ from anybody else who's sort of like playing that video game. And I think that's really, really powerful. But not only can it be a singular experience, it could be an experience where I'm using the video game in a certain way and you're using the video game, and then how we interact in this new world, could show different power dynamics or show different ways of, expressing what it means to be human, which, all sort of art is kind of trying to, explore. And so I just see it, as a kid who grew up on video games, and probably I would say, I guess, one of the first, if not the first generation of people like that. Um, I just see it as being a medium that, with under a slightly different light, which obviously, just kind of happened with digital art more broadly. Then it's like, oh yeah, of course, like how could we not think this was like art? And like that's the way, I see the art world expanding. Like you look at it and it's kind of like it's so hard for people to imagine, you know, photography is not being art. It's like, well, what do you mean? Like, of course that's art. And so I think, it's just, it's so much it will be obvious to future generations, the things that we kind of like still struggle with a bit.
I think that's another one of your kind of like underappreciated significances as an artist. Is it not only were you kind of like almost a bellwether in the general, more establishment art conversation about NFTs, but that you also brought in this kind of creator approach that is about using social media channels and the internet as a distribution device um, to grow an audience and to communicate rather than going through like the kind of the traditional, small gallery, medium-sized gallery, bigger gallery, museum show, kind of traditional, art cursus honorum. And that creator pathway is exactly the kind of pathway that encompasses the artists who are working on video games. It encompasses the artists who are now doing a lot of like, edge case kind of AI model testing and who are, kicking the tires on VO2 and creating like extraordinary kinds of things. And it seems that this is almost a bigger artist population than the traditional fine art population. And it's coming and it's more relevant potentially than some other areas in terms of the way that the culture is changing and a lot of the ways that you've been talking about. And my suspicion is that museums don't know what to do with this creator economy or this creator kind of population that is moving much faster. Like if you're a museum and you're kind of like your core competencies are preserving objects and saying no to other objects that are not, considered appropriate for being associated with those preserved objects. Um, how do you you're really good at moving slow. If you're a museum, that's your core competency. You're really good at moving slow. But in this kind of creator context, you have to learn how to move fast. Um, how how do you think museums are going to be able to wrap their heads or be able to evolve to accommodate this new format of art?
I think that's a good question. I think one of the things you first need to want to do is move fast. And I get the impression through talking with museums that that is actually not the priority of many of them, and that they're sort of see themselves very differently as the sort of antithesis of that, in that everything's moving fast, we're going to move slow and sort of like contextualize things and, you know, be a sort of like antidote to that. And I really understand and can appreciate that viewpoint, but I think attention wise, that is going to be increasingly hard to capture people's actual attention with that sort of like standpoint. And so I personally would love to see museums have at least some part of their programming be focused on trying to be more part of current conversations and be a bit more sort of nimble and a bit more current and really trying to be in the dialogue, because they do have this obviously massive wealth of knowledge of sort of like history in a way that requires them to move just honestly much faster and cut through some of the bureaucracy and cut through some of this. And I think they have the tools to do that will get easier and easier to be part of those conversations. I think it just there needs to be that kind of like willingness there. But it's at the end of the day, 30 years ago, if you wanted to see a painting, you either had to like go find it in a library in a book or go to the museum to see it. Now I can see it in 2 seconds on my phone. And a lot of people, I think, in the museum would say, well, you didn't really see it because you didn't see the actual physical painting. And I honestly think that's kind of an old way of looking at things, because the painting, much of the time, the actual physical object doesn't sort of like matter anymore. It's the ideas behind it. And sort of if the physical object didn't exist, those ideas wouldn't go away and the power of those ideas wouldn't go away. And I think, an example I use of this is sort of like the Van Gogh exhibitions, and people, in the museum world really don't like those exhibitions. And they're like, well, it's not the same as seeing the actual, Van Gogh paintings. But let's assume all of the Van Gogh paintings in the world just burned up in a fire. There's no more Van Gogh paintings. Would suddenly Van Gogh, because we don't have the objects anymore, would he just go away? Would it just be like, well, don't give a fuck about that dude anymore? Like, that's done. Who cares? We don't have the objects, so who cares? It's like, no, the ideas and the way he looked at the world and the way he painted the world and like that lens and the themes and sort of like concepts behind it, that's what's important. Like those are the things that actually sort of like matter about his work versus the actual physical objects. And so, I really hope and I have confidence that museums, more and more museums will sort of, you know, embrace this idea of being able to move a bit more sort of like nimble and really trying to be part of the thing. And I think if they don't, to be quite honest, new institutions will come and fill that void. And sort of again, you look at the MoMA, and the MoMA was born out of, guys, what the fuck are you talking about? Oh, there's all this new work. Like, you're not gonna show it. Fuck it, we'll just do our own thing. Like, and so, there might be a little bit of fuck it, we'll do our own thing, that happens too.
I mean, one thing, going back to your the Van Gogh example, I think that it's almost like an open secret because, like, um, if you are earning a PhD in art history, are you traveling the world like Indiana Jones and putting down a gigantic carbon footprint to see every artwork?
Yeah,
Or,
that's a good point too. Yeah, 100%.
or
Like,
like that's like the way that everybody at the highest possible professional level the most often engages with art is through reproductions. So I don't know if there's a conspiracy there or something, uh, but going back to the fast and slow idea, as I keep on thinking about this Clayton Christensen disruption idea as being like the hammer with every single nail. And that if you are a museum and you are sustaining technology and you want to preserve yourself from being disrupted by these new kinds of solutions that you're talking about, you want to create a skunk works internally that is independent and can act fast, like a little bit like Serpentine Arts and Technologies, like New Ink. You would kind of expect this to be more broadly instituted in museums as almost like a de facto necessity. And you have in Charleston, you've been doing really interesting things with that studio space, from these events that have robot dogs with Trump's head on them walking around and extraordinarily like next generation styles of merging digital and physical art expressions. But you've also been gathering together a lot of like the key tastemakers in the art establishment. And last week you had a convention that I think some people on this call were actually at. That was a really apparently very interesting convention. And can you talk about how you're using your space to try to help the art ecosystem and the art establishment navigate these kinds of changes that you see as being necessary?
yeah, I think the space we have in Charleston here, we've got a sort of 50,000 square foot studio, so it's got a sort of big space, and this is where we, physically make the human one and sort of like pieces like that. But it also has a couple sort of like exhibition spaces. One is more of sort of like a white wall kind of like gallery, sort of like almost what I see the sort of like museum of the present being, that shows, kind of 20 years of my sort of like artistic practice. And then the other side is more of like a like 12,000 square foot immersive space that is sort of wraparound projections and sort of columns wrapped with TVs, and that we can obviously change very quickly and do a wide variety of sort of like programming there. And the programming that we've sort of focused on is mainly events. And more broadly speaking, what I'm trying to do is look at and explore some of the ways in which I think museums will look and function and curate and bring people together in the future. Um, and I personally think every museum will have a room like this that's digital, and they can show many, many different artists very quickly, and they can have the programming change from 8 a.m. in the morning to 10 p.m. at night. And it's a place where people can come together and sort of, like you said, have an experience that is a bit more uh sort of like visceral and a bit more sort of communal, in a way that I don't think many museums are sort of currently catering towards. They're currently, to me, feel like libraries in a way, and that you come in, be quiet, and just look at the stuff and then get the fuck out. And to me, I think in the future, museums will be more of a communal area for people to come together and potentially spend, hours talking with their friends and sort of seeing different things and being really immersed in art. And also immersed in art in a way that is, you're all viewing the same thing at the same time, because we all have enough time where we're all in our own little worlds, walking around with our heads down, all experiencing different things, even if we're in the same room together. And so I think the museum, of the future will be a bit different than that. And so I'm really just trying to kind of test out ideas that, to be honest, I have no interest in me personally scaling, and just sort of like, well, we'll see if this works, and kind of, if somebody wants to run with this idea, amazing. Yeah.
I always think that like a big part of art is creative problem solving. So that must be um, a fun problem to be applying yourself to. And I want to just like ask one more question before going to open up some audience questions for the long-suffering people who have been kind enough to stick with us. Um, but I guess, AI is the topic we haven't really talked about. That and the tree of knowledge is your first generative piece. You started out your everyday series, hand hand making your artworks, and then you moved into video game, creative software. How are you using AI today, and how do you anticipate your work kind of intersecting with AI in the near term of the next, like, I don't know, 2 to 3 years?
Yeah, I think to me, there's a piece that we just sort of kind of unveiled last week called diffuse control, which I think is really the first piece that, to me, kind of fully makes use of sort of AI and the possibilities there. And I think what I'm most interested in is works that um, could not exist without AI. And I think there's a lot of sort of like apprehension around AI. And to me, it boils down to, if you are looking at as a tool for humans to do less, you're going to be very fearful of it. If you are looking at AI as a tool for humans to do more, you're going to be really inspired by it and sort of, really wanting to dig into the sort of like possibilities there. And diffuse control is a work in which curators choose artworks that then become part of the sort of like sculpture. And so the AI really is embedded in it, and it couldn't exist without that piece of it, because it's really like a system for creating an infinite amount of sort of like artworks. And so to me, that is, something that I think can be applied in many, many different ways. And the speed in which this is progressing is just, on a near daily basis, opening up new possibilities and new ideas that I honestly feel like overwhelmed by, in trying to even, sort of wrap my head around, because it's just constantly like, oh, now I could do this, and okay, your API for that could plug into this, and then you could pipe this in, and then it could look at the image and tell what that is and spit out back this, and so I mean, to be quite honest, even 2 to 3 years out, I don't even know. I mean, we're literally 2 years, since ChatGPT is out, and so I really like it's hard for, and that's not even that long. Like, you didn't say 20 years, you're like 2 years. It's like 20 years. I have absolutely no idea. Like, I mean, even 2 years, I don't even know what could potentially be possible then. But I do think, to me, I hear a lot of people being like, this is the end of sort of creativity. And I think that's just absolutely the opposite. I feel 100% it has raised the bar for creativity so much more, in that I regularly see things that if I had seen that, 5 years ago, I've been like, oh my God, this is amazing. Like, wow, like this is so cool. And now I see it and it's like, it's fine. It's whatever. It's like, it's not that like it, because the craft part of it has been democratized in a way that the ideas have to be so strong and so original and so new, because anybody can make anything in 2 seconds. And so I really just see this as being a tool that is just going to unlock a massive amount of just pure creativity.
I like there's that Bill Gates quote that you always overestimate how much change is going to happen in 2 years, and you underestimate how much change is going to happen in 10 years. And I think that we're over that 2 year like kind of period. And now we're getting into that weird, back neck of the woods of these 8 years. And it's like I was just thinking that, following what art is over these next couple of years is going to be like playing Quidditch, where you're trying to catch that golden snitch and it's constantly switching around where it is, and that is going to be so much fun. But thank you so much for coming on the show.
Yeah, no, thank you so much. I very, very much appreciate it. And yeah.
So let's see if we have some questions in the audience. I would love to see if we can call on. Um, ba, 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 ba. Lots of great comments, lots of amazing commentary over here. Um, there's a lot of questions for you to sign various things and put art in various different places. You know what? Okay, I'm going to ask you. Here's a nice question. Luke Watson, would you like to ask your question?
Oh boy, I guess.
What up, Patty?
Uh, hey, so yeah, to paraphrase, maybe it's the exact thing I wrote. ETH, it sucks. It sucked for like the past 3 years. If you look at it as a pure cryptocurrency, Bitcoin all-time highs, ETH all-time high in November of 2021. And yet, most of the more prominent digital art NFTs are on ETH. So, what does ETH's issues foretell for the future of this art's value, consideration, status? Stuff like that.
Sure. So, I think it's very tough because so much of this is kind of momentum based. And if, you know, 3 months from now, ETH hit an all-time high, I'd be like, ETH's fucking great. I love it. Like, I never doubted it. And it's just kind of like, because at the end of the day, you know, you didn't say it sucks because of technological XYZ. You're just like, well, the price of this is higher, and so this thing sucks now. And so and you know, not to say that it doesn't have issues and gas fees and blah blah blah, but to me, personally, in terms of sort of like art, I'm not so concerned about the, you know, what chain this is on or what, you know, this or that. Like, to me, that doesn't really matter. It's kind of like focusing, I look at it a bit as sort of like focusing on, well, what brand of canvas was this painting, you know, or what kind of acrylic paint did they use for blah blah blah. It's like, dude, who gives a fuck? Like, you're not gonna give a fuck about this in the future. And I'm trying to figure out how I can make work that people will give a fuck in 50 years. And if you can make something that people still care about in 50 years, that's really hard, but they will figure out how to preserve it. You can still boot up Apple IIe's and figure out, you know, in this mainframe, things that long ago, you know, should have stopped working, but we care about them. And so we'll figure out how to do it. There's paintings that are covered in 300 years worth of crap and dust and smoke and dirt and blah blah blah, and we spend months, years, whatever, refurbishing them because we care about that painting. So again, uh, making something people give a fuck about in the future, really hard. Preserving it in the future will be really easy, and they're not going to really give a fuck what chain it was on, to be quite honest. I personally think. So I don't like getting too in the weeds on that. You know, to me is like ETH seems like it's going to be around for a hot second, and so, you know, that's where I'm at.
Masha Alma, would you like to ask your question? Oh, sorry, no mic. Okay, so I can read your question for Mike. Um, so Masha Alma asks, who are the artists in the space that you admire at the moment?
I think there's a lot of people who are doing, you know, really different, interesting things, that I often take sort of like little ideas from. I think it's usually not sort of like one or two people. I often reach out to different artists, even just tiny little things where it's like, I've never seen like that before, or like, you know, I've never seen something rendered like that, or you using a smart contract in this way. And so to me, that's what I think is so exciting about the space, is that you can see all of these different ways and different sort of like techniques, and people are really open to sort of like sharing how they did things and sort of like pushing the space forward in, you know, kind of a sort of like communal way. And so I'm really, it's like a massive amount of artists that I'm kind of, you know, find sort of tiny little things from versus just, you know, a few artists that I'm kind of, you know, inspired by, I think.
And Mike Kislovsky, would you like to ask your question? Oh, no Mike here either. Okay, so let me ask that one. So, our industry, design slash MoGraph, is divided when it comes to AI, a lot of which comes from how the data sets are built. Have you ever thought about building or curating a data set for training models that is seen by others as more humane? Would an AI toolkit built on a certain specific method be more interesting to you than other traditional ones like Midjourney, Kriya, etc.?
So I think that is an interesting question. And I think the idea of what is quote unquote humane, is a little sort of like backwards. Because I personally think the models that were trained on everything are actually and having those be available to everybody to use are the most humane thing. Because the alternative is very rich people training models on the work of others that were not intended for that, and then them being able to use it and you not being able to use that. And I often see people will see things where it's like, oh, look, it copied Spider-Man, or it copied this Pixar shit. And it's like, guy, you don't own Spider-Man. You don't own that Pixar character. Let fucking Sony worry about that. Let Disney worry about that. Why don't you use that tool to be able to make things on the work that you did for those movies that you don't now own, but you can now access through this new technology? And so I really think thinking that these open source models that were trained on everything are going to like go away or not be used or sort of like outlawed is really I don't know what the word is. It's just not going to happen. And so I think I look at those open source models as everybody threw their hat in the ring. And when everybody throws in their hat in the ring, it's kind of an even playing field. And now we all have this crazy tool to be able to sort of like use. And the idea that this is the first time that your data has been scraped for the collective good of everybody is crazy. Google Images, like, again, they're literally taking and scraping all of the images and showing them exactly and then selling ads against it. And so, like, this is a much more distilled version of that, of course. And so, me personally, I think I would be focused on how can you use those tools to, in a commercial sense, speed up the way that you work and make yourself more useful, because they're not going away. And also the clients, I promise you, do not give a fuck how you make the work. They want it as quick as possible and as cheap as possible, period.
Great advice. Okay, so Daniel DeLuca, you have a question that's in a similar register. Do you want to ask your question? See if we have another.
Hi, yeah, I'm just curious about like any advice that you have for younger creators. I teach at the university level, and so people who are maybe don't have tons of resources, but are interested in getting their foot in the door in terms of being digital creators. Any kind of advice you might have for getting started and building momentum?
I think, to me, if they again are sort of looking to do commercial work, they need to learn these AI tools. Like, there's no way around that. They are going to be so pervasive. And I think the biggest advice I would make to younger people is to just make an insane amount of stuff. I had been making art for 8 years before I started the Everydays, and I had made, I don't even know, 50 short films and many, many other things. And I also see, an attitude of like, well, I'm not going to do anything unless I'm paid for it. And it's like, ooh, that's like, I did so much work for free when I was starting out. One, to hone my craft, and two, to build a name for myself. And I think looking at opportunities in which you can, potentially trade work for exposure, I think is, what I would be looking at doing when you're a younger person starting out, because I think there are those opportunities. You just have to be smart about recognizing which opportunities could elevate your platform and which are just people trying to take advantage of you to get kind of, get free work. But we live in a time where it's simultaneously never been harder and never been easier to kind of be a artist. I am from a very small town in Wisconsin in which there is no art. Nobody gives any shit about art. I don't have any connections to the art world. And so through just purely putting out a massive amount of sort of like artwork and building an audience, I am now, sitting here. And that can be done from anywhere, any of the world with, these tools that are now cheaper and cheaper and cheaper. And so, yeah, make shit.
What great advice. Okay, so let's end on one question that touches on the inevitable digital note that we have not mentioned yet. So, Beth Pardo, would you like to ask your metaverse question?
Oh, yeah, sure. So we were talking about art galleries, and I'm working on a project with a virtual art gallery, which sort of trying to develop. And I wondered what your thoughts are on the potential for virtual art galleries. We have a 3D art gallery, and you go in and peruse stuff and have images of not just 2D, but also sculptural, and ideally linking to 3D immersive art as well through that, where you kind of embed, you embed the stuff and you can connect through the art gallery to other original artworks. And I just wonder what your thoughts are in terms of creating that community and also having it a little more interactive, a little bit more engaging as a way of displaying art and promoting artists also to wider audiences.
Sure. So, I have been sort of very interested in VR since, again, this sort of modern resurgence with the DK1 and sort of early kind of Oculus Rift stuff. And I'm convinced that we will get there where virtual reality is a more viable sort of like medium that reaches a large amount of people. But I believe that will be after AR first, kind of captures everyone's attention. And I believe 10, maybe 20 years from now, we will all have those glasses on and we will be seeing a bunch of crazy sort of, things in our environment. And then I believe after that, we will sort of move into virtual worlds that are completely sort of like made up. And those will have traction. Right now, the technology, just to be quite honest, is, in my opinion, not really there for kind of like mass consumption, in that people don't want to wear the headsets. The headsets are very uncomfortable. Doing it for more than 5 minutes, you're like, okay, I can't. Like, you feel like a freaking weirdo if you're like in public wearing these headsets. You look like a goon. Like, and so I think there's a lot of technological and sort of like sociological challenges that will be overcome through AR before VR, personally. Yeah, so that's how I kind of see things sort of like playing out over a long period of time.
And what about the galleries that are you can actually view just on your laptop? Like that you don't have to wear the headset. You don't have to go into VR. You can actually go into the gallery on your laptop or on digital mobile.
I think some of those are interesting, but I personally have not seen something that was super compelling yet, because I think it's trying to recreate a physical experience in a way that feels sort of, this isn't kind of the right term, but like anthropomorphic in a way, in that, like, you see a painting over there in the virtual gallery, and then you have to hold, a forward button to walk over there, and it's like, okay, well, I just want to see it immediately. Like, I don't, like, it feels like I'm like faking walking over there for like what advantage? And so it's like this like weird, like, you're trying to recreate all of kind of the like, in a sense, like unnecessary parts of a gallery just because it looks like a gallery in a way. And so versus you could actually look at Instagram as a very efficient gallery in that it's like I can immediately just like next, and I can see like 100 things in like 2 seconds without having to like physically move my character around to these like 100 different things. And so yeah, I think that's kind of the experience that I've sort of like personally had with them.
I think a funny way to look at it is that, the white cube gallery was invented to try to strip away as much of your perception of being in a space and isolate, your encounter with the object, which is like what a screen does. Much
Yeah.
much faster with less
Friction.
friction and having to, use your calories to move around. But this has been amazing.
Yeah,
Thanks,
thank you
Mike.
so much. Yeah, very much. And again, I'm sorry for being late here. I very much appreciate everybody sticking around so that we could do this because, yeah, I very much had a great time chatting, and hopefully everybody got a tiny nugget of something out of it.
Very good. So thanks everybody for joining. We've got a great show next week with Chris Lyons, the president of Web3 Media at A16 Crypto. So we'll be able to delve down into a little bit more of like the string theory of where NFTs and blockchain-based art are today. And I want to say thank you again to Digital Original, who we are proud to have as our inaugural sponsors on Art World. Their team is doing some really incredible work in creating solutions to bridge the physical and digital art markets. And you can look forward to hearing more about them on Art World soon. So thank you, everybody. This has been great and very adrenalizing. So I feel ready to take a nap. But thanks, everyone. Bye.
Awesome. Thank you, guys.